here, and we are now recording the session now that we're not talking about baseball. So let's think a little bit about our teaching and learning at a distance text here that we've been using as the basis for what we're doing. One of the things the authors talk about is a difference between a profession and a craft. Obviously, they're talking about distance education and what makes it a profession or a craft. What's the difference, at least according to James Fenn, who's the person who's being quoted here, between a profession and a craft?
Kind of a really basic thing would be having a profession is you have some sort of certification. I would say a piece of paper that says you can do this, while a craft is hands-on training and you don't necessarily need some kind of, again, institutional paper.
Well, you're moving in the right direction. What did James Fenn say that a profession needed beyond certification?
Theory.
And?
On theory.
Theory and?
Say formal education.
What's Simonson really big on? Theory and?
I guess I missed that somehow.
I did too.
And your bandwidth is low sitting there in the car. Where's ChatGPT when you need it?
I'm trying to get like some of my stuff up on my iPad while we're talking.
You can do that.
Hopefully the hotspot will
pick up there. You've got enough of a phone connection for that.
Hopefully.
What do you use theory as a basis for, conceptually speaking? What does theory allow one to do as a next step?
Develop research?
Yes, exactly that. Simonson is really big on theory and research. And in an earlier chapter, one of the things he talked about was distance education needs good theory and more research to provide a formal basis for distance education as a profession, so that it's not just a craft where people try stuff and just keep the things that work. I mean, there's nothing wrong with trying things, and there's certainly nothing wrong with keeping things that work. But Simonson's point is that if we're really going to be a full-fledged profession, we need theory that accounts for the phenomena we encounter, and we need research that allows us to test those theories and move forward in a data-based way instead of just kind of thrashing around trying stuff until we get a good combination. Important idea for Simonson. He keeps coming back to that as a very important foundation for distance education as a discipline. This particular chapter deals a fair bit with things like research in various ways. One of the things that he talks about is a Department of Education meta-analysis that comes up with, that people claim says online education is superior to traditional methods. Where does that misinterpretation come from? It's not what the study actually says, but it's what a lot of people actually claim the study says.
Well, talking about online learning, it's in and of itself does not make it superior. That you had to take into account instructors and media available to properly assess the success.
Okay, say more. What success are you talking about when you say that, Melissa?
For learning and understanding, just because it's online doesn't make it good. You still have to have good instruction and participation. Basically, the same stuff you do in the classroom, just online. What did
the study actually claim? That Department of Education study.
I think it said that they didn't they had more learning time as opposed to like the classroom.
The study said a number of things. It said online students spent more time interacting with their content. That was one of them. What else did it say about them?
They had more collaboration time.
They collaborated differently from people in a classroom, which in some cases meant more time. It also said they had access to more materials. So it said a lot of things about these online students, and it said that they performed better. So why can't we conclude that online education is better? I mean, all those are good measures, right? You want students to spend time on their content that you're trying to teach them. You want them to use a variety of materials. You want them to collaborate with one another on things like projects and discussions. What's the problem with I mean, Melissa, you're on the right vein there. When you're saying you still need good things happening, why though, why can't the results of this study be legitimately interpreted to mean that online education is better if all these good things happened with the online classes they studied? I mean, they've got data to show that these things were there.
I think, the situation wasn't quite equivalent, it wasn't exactly the same. So it was,
Yeah, what were some of the differences?
um, like the way that, um, like just the overall setting, I think it said the elements and the treatment conditions, like the learning time, collaboration efforts, and on the online ones.
This really wasn't a controlled study. They didn't have two different groups of students who were doing pretty much the same thing under the same conditions, except one group was online and one group wasn't. They didn't control for a lot of different factors. And one that's not mentioned in your textbook here, but that will probably really resonate with both of you guys now that we have experienced the pandemic. The data set for that Department of Education study only included students who had opted in to online education, students who'd said, I want an online class. Now, there's nothing wrong with saying I want an online class, but you can't just automatically say teaching a group of students online who want to be online is exactly the same as teaching a group of students online who don't want to be online. And in the pandemic, one of the things we encountered was a lot of students who didn't want to be online. And with that variable, well, clearly online education was facing some headwinds as far as being able to accomplish the same learning outcomes with a group of students who very strongly objected to the setting in the first place. So it's not that the Department of Education setting lied about anything. It's the Department of Education meta-analysis was easy to misinterpret and was missing some really important factors that we now understand are part of understanding the big picture, part of refining our theory and our research to account for what actually happens in real life and when things will work well and why they'll work well. One of the things Simonson talks about is interaction or research on interaction. What does he suggest for an optimal class size if you've got one instructor and you're teaching an online college level course? Say something like this one. What would be optimal?
It said something like an optimal size would be 20, but for optimal levels of interaction, it was like between 15 and 16. But then it also said a class that was too small could cause issues.
Yeah, we're encountering a few of those, especially if Joy hadn't joined us from her car there. We would be definitely hitting some of the shortcomings of the small. Yeah, 20 plus or minus 5 is, and there's a fair bit of consensus on that. I mean, you can't pin it down to the individual and say, 15 is great, 14 is awful. It's not that simple. But in terms of what do you aim for? Yeah, 20 plus or minus 5. Now, that really gives the lie to some of the financial folks who would like to grow enrollments in online classes without boundaries, and say, well, now, now we've got this class online. We can change the class size limit from 30 to 100 or 30 to 200. No. That's obviously, it doesn't scale up that way if you've got a single instructor, because there are many things that don't scale as you grow the enrollment in an online class. Like what?
A teacher.
Well, say more. What could the teacher do, say, with 20 plus or minus 5 that the teacher can't really do with, say, 200 plus or minus 50?
Give any
Well,
students any sort of individual attention.
Yeah, that's one of them. And individual attention might mean things like feedback when they're grading. Do they have time to actually write commentary on assignments? Not if you got 200 students, you're not going to do
Let's
that.
say have a grad student doing all their
And we'll talk about that
grading.
later, that is definitely a relevant point. Yes. When you think about things like discussions, it's really hard to have an asynchronous discussion with 200 people. And in fact, when you get to 20 people in an asynchronous discussion, it can be kind of busy in there with everybody responding to prompts and everybody responding to everybody else. When you have small group activities, it's pretty easy to set up small group activities with 20 plus or minus 5. I mean, you have small groups of 3, 4 students, something like that. Setting up small groups with 200 plus or minus 50, just the sheer logistics, even if you get the computer to randomly assign people, just getting everything set up and keeping it moving forward can occupy a massive amount of time that then is not spent interacting with students on a person-to-person basis, either live or asynchronously. So that 20 plus or minus 5 is important, and it's frequently ignored. If you look closely, you'll notice WVU has raised the maximum class sizes for the remaining online courses that it offers. And last time I looked, the ones that used to be 20 are now 30. So they're twisting the dial incrementally, facing their structural budget deficit, I suppose, trying to deal with that. One of the things that Simonson says about interaction, says it's a myth to say the more interaction there is in a distance ed class, the better. Why would he say that's a myth?
I think that he said that there needed to be a balance, um, because like interaction is important, but if it feels like it's forced between the students, that's not always the best situation either.
Mm-hmm.
I had that written down.
Okay, and that's a true thing.
I think it said that like the early forms there was mainly just one-way interaction. There wasn't any very little interaction between the student and the teacher, and so that wasn't great either, and the students and the other students. So
It's true. Early versions of distance ed had very little interaction. So it's easy to misinterpret his statement here. He's not saying that interaction isn't good in distance education. He's not saying that interaction does not contribute to the success of a distance education experience. He's saying it's not a be all and end all. I mean, it would be very easy to say, okay, the more interaction, the better. So above all else, I'll make sure that my online class has lots and lots of interaction. And Simonson would say, well, lots of interaction is good, but there's something more, even more important than interaction. What is it? He's looking for a balance that incorporates not only a lot of interaction in an online class, but something else. And that's probably not made explicit in there, Joy. It may require some reading between the lines. That happens sometimes.
The one thought I had was that there are some students that just need time to themselves to learn. And sometimes too much interaction can, I guess, muddle things up when you just need some time to think.
Well, it's true. I mean, it is possible to overdo interaction. It's possible to require too much interaction for some people, but Interaction aside, what would Simonson say is even more important in distance education than interaction? And I know that's not explicit in there where you can pull it out
Like
from a highlighted sentence.
side of the teacher or from the side of the student?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Like the interaction, the
Put
most like the most
interaction aside. Put interaction aside for the moment. And interaction aside, with the statement that in general, yes, interaction is good and we want to see it in distance education, yes. But putting interaction aside, there's something even more important that needs to be present in a distance ed class. Something or things.
that the teacher be competent.
Yes, exactly that. That the teacher and the teaching be competent. That the teacher be competent, the learning activities be appropriate, that the students actually encounter the content, the material of the course. And he's saying interaction can't make up for that if that's not present. First and foremost, you need good pedagogy. And as it turns out, in an online class, interaction is a definite part of that. But if you're a math teacher, your students need to be encountering a lot of math from you and from the materials and from the learning activities. You know, if you're teaching them how to sew, Melissa, they need to be encountering an awful lot of information about how to sew well from you and from the materials, from the videos they watch, from the samples. That's going to be really important in addition to the interaction. So Simonson wants to be clear that the best online classes aren't just interactive. Yeah, they're going to be interactive. They're going to have something very important above and beyond just interaction. And it's easy to lose sight of that along the way. Switch over to Stephen Johnson for a little bit. He talks again about cities, as he often does, and various kinds of networks. A metropolis, big city, shares what key characteristic with the web? How is a big city like the World Wide Web?
I had that it was a dense liquid network, which like I think we talked about that a little bit.
Yes, it's a dense liquid network. Information can flow easily along lots of different unpredictable paths, go lots of different places, and encounter lots of other unpredictable information in a city or in a dense liquid network. So that means that lots of partial ideas, half-baked ideas, can encounter lots of other half-baked ideas, and sometimes they form complete ideas. When that happens, bingo, the light bulb goes on over the head. Something suddenly makes sense, a new concept, a new invention. Why does he talk about the FBI's computer systems prior to 2001 as what he called a hunch killing system?
Um,
I found this story a little confusing. It talked about the hunch was environmental, which I still thought sounded kind of odd, but it's like it wasn't connecting with other information, that the information was just saved into a file that nobody saw.
Not only did it not connect, but the system was specifically designed to keep it from connecting, the system that they were using there, which is why he called it a hunch killing system, because not only did stuff just not happen to connect, they had deliberately constructed a process to prevent half-baked ideas from encountering other half-baked ideas. Now, there's obviously some reason for that. That wasn't just a random choice. They weren't just mean people doing that. But why would they have done that?
I'm not sure why they did that.
That was one of the things I didn't really understand.
Okay. Why? One of the
Let
things that law enforcement in general, at least at high levels, and the FBI in particular, are pretty well known for is the idea that you have access to information only on a need to know basis.
Oh,
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean?
just like the
security,
hospital, you don't need to
security
access.
clearance. There's also
You have,
security clearance. Only certain people at certain levels are allowed to know things. So they don't want, if you're going to have things talk to each other, you can't have it talk to information that's not privy to others. So it's, I guess, just to be more secretive.
well, or more to be a little more generous, perhaps to be a bit more secure from an information
Secure, yeah,
perspective. I don't think they're deliberately setting out to be secretive in the sense of gleefully hiding things. I think they're concerned about releasing information more widely than they feel would be, well, fill in the blank here, legal, ethical, moral, depending on what your perspective is. Joy, you were talking about the medical perspective on that. Why you're talking about keeping patient information secure in various ways in the record system. So what would need to be true to access confidential private health information about a particular patient? What situation would have to be true of me, say, for me to get a look at that information?
I mean, you have to be taking care of that patient and have to know
Right.
what's.
Yes, I'd have to be taking care of that patient, and I would have to have some question in mind on which that information had bearing. You know, maybe they have a heart condition and there's information there about their blood tests and the various levels of different substances in their blood. And one could make a legitimate case that as a cardiologist, I would need to know those particular details. That's a need to know. But that's not a random collection of ideas and data colliding with other ideas and data. That's a deliberate inquiry on the part of an individual working on a specific task like patient care or investigating a particular crime of one kind or another, which is the antithesis of just letting data fly around and interact with other data. I mean, security often gets in the way of many things, but there's a legitimate case to be made for keeping some kinds of data secure. I mean, I don't particularly like the idea that all the data I have on file medically with my doctor could just be, projected out across the web to interact with all the other data on the web. Well, no, that's, that doesn't seem correct to me. And in fact, it's not. I mean, obviously, it's not legal for that to happen. But the point is that there is a bit of a reason why the FBI did that. The problem is that then those half-baked ideas never get to be completed because you're operating in, well, not a dense liquid network, but I guess maybe a dense solid network where nothing can move and interact. What would it, what would be the good side and bad side of having the FBI use something that was more like the web? What would be the
Well,
advantage?
like you were looking for someone on the move or something like that, and you shared some of that information, I guess, about that potential person, and people caught wind of it, they could maybe catch the person quicker.
Well, yeah, there's the potential for a lot more information to be flooding in and interacting with other information. I don't know if either of you use Nextdoor, the social media network that's for local neighborhoods, but it contains a lot of bizarre complaints from people who spend their time parting the curtains and looking out the window.
I hate
But it's
that.
also remarkably good at things like finding lost dogs and cats in my neighborhood, because that's exactly what happens. Somebody sort of puts out a call and a bunch of people chime in. Oh, I saw him over on Sidden Street at 310 this afternoon, headed south, and somebody else will chime in, and before you know it, the critter's been located and made its way back home. But the downside, well, what's the downside of having lots of legal criminal investigation information widely available?
The wrong people can find it.
The wrong people can find it, and wrong could be different, mean different things in different
Mean
contexts,
different
but
things, yeah.
there's a lot of information there that for some pretty good reasons isn't necessarily widely distributed on the front page of whatever you're reading locally there. So there is a downside, but I found it fascinating to contemplate what the opposite of the web might look like and what the consequence of operating in a system that was, as he described it, kind of the opposite of the web. Let's look at preparing for the digital university. This is George Siemens and Company. It's a rather large study underwritten by the Gates Foundation. This particular chapter that we're looking at reports on a tertiary study. What you probably know what a primary study is. You may know what a secondary study is. What are those? And what's a tertiary study?
Well, primary study is when you're collecting your own data, you're collecting
Right.
it yourself. What's
Okay.
secondary is you are using other people's data to then construct a new conclusion, or using it to help you work on a new conclusion. Excuse me. That's still something that you have made, where tertiary is it's all from stuff that you found.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that would be my.
Okay,
That's my
that can work. Yeah, that can work as an explanation. The kind of study that is sometimes called a meta-analysis usually falls into the secondary research category here. This tertiary study, it's kind of a review of the literature with an analysis to go along with it. In other words, the authors of this tertiary study didn't actually go out there and gather any data on the ground themselves. They started by collecting studies that other people had either conducted as primary research or even as secondary research and meta-analyses. And they put all those in a big pile and tried to figure out, are there themes that we're seeing here, either in the primary studies or in the meta-analyses, the secondary research that we're seeing here. Oftentimes the reason why a tertiary study is done is to find additional topics in need of further research, trying to identify holes in what's out there and what's been done. So the reason that they were doing this is to try to figure out, where does the existing work cluster? And where, if we look at that in a sort of a graphic sense, where are the holes? Where are the gaps? Where are the areas where work has not been done yet that could bear looking into here? Take a look on page 114, if you've actually got preparing for the digital university there. They've got a number of major points where they found most of the major studies of online learning agreed. I'm curious about how you see this stacking up against the list we looked at from Simonson that we saw some time ago. If you've got Simonson with you, it's on page 9 of Simonson. So we've got stacking up page 114 of preparing for the digital university with page 9 of Simonson, two different lists of major points. How do they compare? What's similar? What's different?
I think there's a lot of similarities in them. The preparing for the digital universe is pretty specific about like the instructor should moderate the discussion. I think he really brought that to light.
So one of the things that happens there is Siemens, that is preparing for the digital university, emphasizes the role of the instructor a lot more than Simonson does. And that's one example that you've given there. Siemens specifically says, hey, instructors, you need to be moderating those discussions. You need to be reading them and periodically chiming in on them as far as a good online course. Simonson doesn't say a lot about the instructor, actually. He's focused on other points. So yeah, that's a good point. What else? Compare, contrast. This is analysis level stuff as far as Bloom's taxonomy.
They both mentioned that, there should be a lot of interaction between students.
Okay.
As the preparing the digital universe said that there should be a lot of good support for the students.
Okay. Simonson mentions support systems. Siemens doesn't say much about support systems. In fairness, most of the studies that Siemens looked at were focused on a single course as opposed to something like a program. So a lot of the studies there didn't really get into the territory where you'd notice support systems and say much about them. But in any case, he didn't talk a lot about them. And Simonson does talk quite a bit about it. What else?
Both of them talked about like having, the one talked about content should be visually engaging and interactive. The other one just said visualization of ideas and concept is critical when designing the instruction.
But they both got visualization in there in one way or another. They're saying, it's not just words. There's more to it than just words to make this stuff work. What else?
Um, the digital universe, they talk about instructional scaffolds,
Mm-hmm.
which is, I think, similar to, he doesn't use the word scaffold, but Simonson says it should be carefully designed and developed before instruction begins, but he doesn't really use the word scaffolds.
So there's some planning there involved, right? Some planning ahead.
Mm-hmm.
And you're right, he doesn't use the term scaffolding. We will encounter scaffolding again a little bit later on as an important idea. Anything else you noticed?
I think Simonson also mentioned some things about assessment.
Mm-hmm. Siemens didn't say anything about assessment. That's an interesting gap, and I don't know what accounts for that. But assessment, at least in my opinion, is real important. So yeah, Simonson talked quite a bit about it for good reason. Siemens didn't. Siemens, on the other hand, explicitly talks about including cooperative and collaborative learning. Simonson never really got there as far as his particular list of things. One of the things that preparing for the digital university talks about is they say the research supports the idea that instructors who are teaching in distance ed settings need to either redistribute their responsibilities among a team of instructors. Now, that might include TAs, like you were talking about, Melissa, or assign more obligations to students that the instructor might have done in a different context. Why? Why the change in instructor role? Offloading duties.
I guess trying to have a more student-centered role, having
Bingo.
the students do more.
Well,
And
yeah, absolutely. It's about being a more student-centered process, which is not only about having students take more responsibility potentially for their learning process, but it's also about being able to differentiate as an instructor for differing needs of different students. And the idea is that as we go more in that direction, it takes more time and energy from an instructor to individualize. Melissa's different from Joy is different from Savannah, and the information and the feedback that each of you need is likely to be different. The more an instructor needs to do that thing, the less time they have for administrivia of one kind or another. So if you can get somebody else to do some of the administrivia, It's helpful. And administrivia is not a very complimentary term. I probably shouldn't use that particular term, but a silly example of that, maybe not a silly example, a trivial example of that. I don't know if you've noticed or not, but if you do the alternative assignment for one of these Zoom sessions, I give you very specific instructions for what to name the file that you submit to me with your work for that week. I didn't used to do that. And I found that I was using a ridiculous amount of time trying to find students' assignments that they had turned in so I could read them and give them credit for the work that they had done. Now, I still read them, but now I don't waste any time finding them. I know exactly what they're called. I can go straight there and read it and give a student points, and it's done. And I don't know if I think both of you have turned in assignments at one time or another for the alternative, but you may have noticed when you mail it to me, sometimes there's a time lag, but I will respond in email to indicate that I got it, and points will show up in the grade book on eCampus. And for me, that has all become one task. And it makes it possible for me to track those things and not use massive amounts of time for it. Yeah, it's a silly example. It's a small, trivial example, but multiply that by 20, 50, 100,
Mhm.
and you get a semester's worth of work. And the more time that I'm not spending looking for that file you sent me 2 weeks ago, the more time I'm spending doing things like writing feedback on your assignments, which one hopes is a helpful thing there. Question, what did I have here? Looking back at John Seeley Brown. One of the most significant requirements for further adoption of online learning, according to this particular reading, is the development of well-designed courses with interactive and engaging content, structured collaboration between peers, flexible deadlines to allow students to pace their learning, continuous monitoring of student progress, and the provision of formative feedback when needed. Now that's Siemens and Company talking, right? How does that line up with John Seeley Brown's vision of a learning ecology?
I think it matches pretty well. Seems like similar. I mean, he really, that seems like the things that you would want to be involved with a learning ecology where you're, learning from each other and interacting. Now, he said structured collaboration, which I'm not sure about that term, but
Okay, say more about why you're wondering about that term, Joey.
um with saying structured collaboration, I guess that would just be like focusing on a topic or something like that. So I don't.
Well, what does structure seem, in general, what does structure connote? What does it sound like Siemens is describing here that you're familiar with?
Like having guidelines, having points, having things that you wanted the
Wait,
students to.
this is sounding a lot like a college course, isn't it? I mean, given all those things that he rattled off there, I mean, it's sounding like potentially a pretty well designed college course, but it's
Mhm.
sounding like it might be a degree program or a certificate program or an online course. Is that the same thing as a learning ecology?
Well, I haven't said that ecology is more of an open and adaptive system.
Yeah. Now, what Siemens is describing isn't antithetical to a learning ecology. If I'm a learner and I am exploring a learning ecology around me in search of information about some topic that I'm passionate about, if I find a college course in that topic, Yeah, sure. Enrolling in that, no biggie. It's just that there are also lots of other options out there that are less formal that I might potentially be taking advantage of to learn as well. There's nothing wrong with taking a college course as part of a learning ecology, but a learning ecology includes many, 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 many things that are not like college courses that are much less formal, which leads us into the next reading, which is mapping the open educational landscape. That's the one you read in perusal and put some notes into, some annotations in perusal there. So I think this one showed up last week. Either that or it showed up in 640. I don't remember which. What's the difference between open education and distance education? Joy, didn't you ask that?
Did I ask that?
Somebody
Um,
asked that within the last week. I don't remember who it was. How do you distinguish open education and distance education?
I think open ed.
Actually, I think it might have been me
Oh, okay. That's fine.
about the open education is more to be intentionally free for anyone to use and share and modify.
It's often free. It's not always free, but it frequently is. It's more of a co-op kind of arrangement, a collaborative kind of arrangement where everybody who's interested is helping everybody who's interested learn about something they're interested in. In my particular neighborhood here, it happens to be gardening with native pollinator plants.
Would this count like watching instructional YouTube videos?
Oh, potentially. That's one of the ways that one learns, right? And maybe you get so interested in one particular YouTube influencer that you decide to subscribe because that individual has so much good information that you keep coming back to them and you build them into your particular personal learning network. Man, I do that. There's a fellow named Calvin Jones who works for Park Tool, a bicycle tool company. He's a part of my personal learning network because I watch a bunch of Calvin's videos on how to fix bicycles. It's not a formal college course, it's a YouTube video, and you could consider it an open educational resource. And when you say free to use, that's what open educational resources are. They're educational resources that don't cost anything, that can be
But like
freely
you said,
shared.
it's not quite free if you're watching YouTube and then you have to watch a commercial every so often. So I think that would make it slightly unfree, I guess.
And open education in general isn't always free. I mean, open education and open educational resources are actually significantly different ideas. Open educational resources are the ones that you don't have to pay a lot of money for, whether it's textbooks or videos or whatever. If you've bought a textbook recently, you know that's a big difference. Um, Open education as a concept in general is more the community collaborative sharing learning and teaching together kind of concept, which might or might not take place at a distance. Could be face to face, could be at a distance. In the UK, they've got something called the Open University, which is both. It's a lot of open education being delivered at a distance and has been for decades at this point. There's a huge body of literature on that particular thing. Um, One of the things that I asked you to read and didn't actually put any questions in here about when I told you what we'd be talking about was that Swan Dagan article about the community of inquiry model. I didn't give you any questions about that. I just put a reading in there. They referred to something called social constructivism. Now, I know we've talked about constructivists a little bit in another context. What constructivism is a psychological school of thought. How would you distinguish it from some other approaches that are not constructivism? What are some of the others?
Well, there's like postmodern and um oh, I'm failing on my philosophy.
Think psychology
Objective.
rather than philosophy.
Oh, okay.
You guys excuse me for 1 second. I gotta pop out of my car. Unlock the
Sure,
trunk. My husband, just a second.
sure. What do constructivists believe?
That you always keep learning.
No, there's
That,
a lot more than that. I mean, many people who aren't
well,
constructivists could believe that. What do constructivists believe that other schools of thought about learning don't believe? I guess I should phrase
well,
it that way.
what you know isn't all you can know. There's always more that you can build upon. It's not the true knowledge. You can always move forward, and if you could also prove yourself wrong with new knowledge and adapt.
It's probably true that most constructivists believe that, but I think a fair number of folks who were not constructivist would probably also believe that. What makes a constructivist a constructivist?
I think more of it. I want to pull
Oh,
up
time to type.
yeah.
Now, see, you're working in the spirit of a learning ecology here. You are reaching out beyond the resources provided in the course, and you're looking at other resources to find relevant information. What makes a constructivist a constructivist? Joy is rejoining us. Maybe she can tell us. Joy, what makes a
Sorry,
constructivist a
guys.
constructivist?
Constructivist. I think
They construct knowledge rather than just passively taking in information.
Right. That's what makes a constructivist a constructivist. So there are people out there who aren't constructivist, quite a lot of them, as a matter of fact. And some of them belong to schools of thought, such as behaviorists. Behaviorists believe that what really matters here is observable changes in behavior. And that's really what constitutes learning. If you want to assess learning, you have to look for something measurable or visible in terms of a behavior change. And if none of that is present, a behaviorist would say, well, then no learning has taken place. If nothing observable has changed, no learning. Or some people are cognitivist and they say, well, behaviorist, you're full of it. Of course, things can happen. Learning can occur without an observable change in behavior, because what goes on inside people's heads is really important, even if you can't see it. For example, people can remember things without telling you what they remembered. People can visualize things without describing for you what they're visualizing. We need to be aware of what's going on internally when people think, and we need to teach in ways that help them think more effectively in a variety of ways. So, for example, we need to help by providing them with mnemonic devices so that they can remember important stuff better. And that might not mean that their behavior changes, but it still means learning is taking place. Cognitivists would say that, but they're not really constructivists. Constructivists are the ones who say, well, everybody takes in information and stacks it up in a slightly different way inside their heads. They construct their own, Piaget would call them schemas. Everybody's schema is a little bit different one from another. And for constructivists, the really big deal is that you don't just pass along information intact. You don't just take the wisdom of the previous generation and hand it over and expect that perfect learning will have taken place when it can be parroted back to you. Instead, people have to make it their own. They have to apply it in their own context and organize it in their own way. That's what makes a constructivist a constructivist. Now, what makes somebody a social constructivist, which is what Swandagan was talking about in this reading?
Like building your own social network?
That's part of it. Not necessarily building a social network, but you've hit on a key term there, Joy, which is social. Social constructivist
So taking in your
They
knowledge with other people.
right. They say that not only do you have to construct your own knowledge, but it's all about doing this as part of a context that involves other people. There are other folks around, and you're interacting with them as part of the learning process. And much of your own construction of knowledge as you take it in and digest it and make sense out of it in your own head is done by interacting with other people. And that's really critical. So if you're a social constructivist, you emphasize things like learning activities that involve students interacting with one another around the content of what you're trying to teach. It's possible to be a constructivist without being a social constructivist. You can ignore the social interaction side of it and still be a constructivist. But if you're a social constructivist, you can't ignore the interaction part of it. As you may be able to guess, I probably fall into the social constructivist camp as far as my particular biases. So that's my disclaimer up front.
I've had to do a lot of write-ups on this, so I'm failing myself because I'm consider myself more of a constructivist with interpretive aspects of it, which is kind of then when you were saying you take your own knowledge and then describe it or teach it to others in your own way.
You make it your own. And your own is unique. In the case of any individual, your understanding and organization of a body of content is not going to be identical to anybody else's. From a constructivist standpoint, I mean, that's what we tend to believe. You understand it a little differently than I do, which isn't to say that you understand it better or worse than I do. You just understand it from a slightly different perspective than I do. And they may be both equally accurate. And in the same sense that the blind men all experience the elephant, but none of them has quite the complete picture there. Now, I'm aware that we're kind of running low on time here. We're down to our last few minutes, so this is time for you guys to ask questions. What are you wondering about at this point?
I don't have a question, but I just wanted to tell you something that came to my head when you were talking about the FBI and the medical information and how like the wrong information in the wrong hands. And I'll keep it super short, but basically we had an employee that decided to take a picture of a patient's medical x-ray and post it on social media.
Wow.
She did not have the patient's information, like name was not on it. But that being said, the patient had been stabbed and it was like in the local paper. So it was traced back to her. And of course that puts the hospital in quite a liable situation as well.
Sure.
So
how young was she?
She was pretty young, but definitely should have known better.
I would think that most people who'd be in a position to be able to do that have received some degree of training talking about confidentiality of individual patient data.
This was slightly before, this has been a few years ago, but it was slightly before I think 2006, the HIPAA laws really came into play. I'm showing my age, but
oh, that's recent history to me. I understand what you're talking about.
Yeah. So anyway, sorry, that was kind of off topic, but it's like popped in my head.
You don't want a liquid network conveying your personal health data. Most of us don't, at least. We would feel that that's wildly inappropriate. So yeah, there's some rationale for not putting everything into a liquid network. So questions, things you're wondering about so far as distance education.
I did happen to realize when you said that I found my MOOC in the Open University.
There you go. So what are you going to do a MOOC on, Melissa?
It's on freelance career and creative arts.
There you go. That's a nice fit for who you are and what you do.
I was getting the ones that you showed us all said, well, how did you do this with your students? I'm like, oh, this is this doesn't feel like this is working very well. And I tried to do stuff with fashion, but it goes through FIT and you have to go through so many steps. And I was waiting for the point that it said, now you owe us this much money. And I'm like, where's the cost? Where's the cost? And then when I don't remember what I typed in to bring this up, because I pulled it back. Don't say fashion, say something else. And then that popped up and I'm like, oh, okay. And so like that looks pretty good, and was able to go and see what they said was needed for the class. And I'm like, okay, I can do this. And
Right.
it still seems like I can learn something as opposed to just
There's a MOOC
getting
out there
through
for
it.
everything. I took one on Scottish Gaelic. It has nothing to do with my profession. But you can find a MOOC for anything.
I
I'm
almost
glad you
took the
found
one
it.
that was on the moons of the universe. It was all on teaching about the different moons. I was just like,
No,
oh, that's interesting.
no. Okay, that might be fun. So you guys are looking around for badges and MOOCs, right? So you
Yeah, I
can
wanted to make
complete
sure
that.
I found one, because I don't know why I felt like I was having so much trouble finding one, but I definitely suggest the Open University because there's a lot of different things.
They've been around for a long time. So yeah, there's a massive amount of content there.
That Open University, that do you just type Open University in and
It's called
that comes up?
Open EDU, and they
Open
call it
EDU. Okay.
Open Learn. And
Okay.
there's just
Is
now
there,
they
could you
have some
paste a
stuff that,
URL into the chat,
yeah.
Melissa, so that
Okay,
Joy
this
could
is
get a URL?
let me see if I can start where it starts doing
I bet you could bring it up
Oh,
real
if my-
quick if you've been looking at
well,
it
if
recently.
my computer would go somewhere. There we go. This would be like, I think this is wait, I gotta expand everything now. Where's my chat?
There we go. I will include the chat log, Joy, when I post the video,
Okay. Oh, thank you.
so
Yeah,
you
and
can
there's
get
some
the
stuff that
URL.
costs, there's some stuff that
That
costs
Melissa.
money and then some doesn't, but I mean, there's tons that don't cost money, but even the ones that do cost money, they're like $25. I mean, it still isn't terrible.
That's
but yeah,
open
there's
education,
tons,
you know? It's all
there's
about no
tons that
cost
don't
and low
cost
cost.
anything.
Yeah. Good. Thank you for sharing that particular resource, Melissa. It's always good to have.
Yeah, I just found it this morning. I'm like,
Okay.
oh, I found it.
Excellent. Last call, questions, things you're wondering about.
Sorry, I was all over the place tonight.
You were an active
I-
participant, Joy. You did a
Okay, I tried.
remarkably active job considering that you were at a baseball game. I was impressed. You bailed Melissa out on a couple of occasions there.
I knew, well, I remember you said Savannah wasn't going to be there, and I was like, oh, I just can't leave poor Melissa alone. That's
Melissa
so
was
much
a
pressure.
little
I already feel a
concerned
lot of
about
pressure.
No,
I feel a lot of pressure, but I definitely think probably the extra pressure I'm putting more effort into what I would normally.
I think y'all are doing
So.
great with this. I think you're coming along very well with this, and I hope you're finding that you're learning significant things as part of the process. It looks that way from your work so far.
Yeah, definitely. It's kind of coming together. I think the more classes I have in this, it's starting to make more sense, you know. So
that's usually the way people experience it. The pieces do fit. Everything is, to quote Ted Nelson, everything is deeply intertwingled. The more you become aware of that intertwingledness. Well, that's it for tonight. I'll see you guys next Thursday. I'll turn off our recording here.